Well, the historical books that we're looking at today are going to be Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And they basically illustrate how Israel does under this new covenant that's been inaugurated with them through Moses at Mount Sinai. But of course, Deuteronomy ended with the death of Moses. Deuteronomy was a retelling of the law, but it was also Moses' swan song in that he was preaching passionately to this new generation of Israelites who had come out of Egypt. And he knew that he wasn't going with them into the promised land. He knew their parents, he knew their predisposition to grumbling and idolatry and sin, and so therefore in Deuteronomy he pleads with them to obey God from the heart. He pleads with them and them that the law is not about legalism. The law is about a guide from God that will lead the people into a fruitful and blessed life. And so now in Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, we see how Israel does now that Moses is gone and they're about to enter into the promised land. Now Joshua, in particular, I just want to look at Joshua chapters 1 through 8, and you have a chiastic arrangement of these chapters given to you in your notes. But Joshua, generally speaking, is a very positive book. It shows that when Israel obeys God from the heart in faith, that God works on their behalf and they have victories and they have blessing, just like God had told them would happen in the law. These three books, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, really illustrate how the blessings and curses of the covenant in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26 work. So in Joshua chapter 1, Joshua is personally commanded, encouraged by God to be strong and to be courageous, and particularly to do everything that he's been told to do in the law. Joshua chapter 1 verse 6, for instance, God says to Joshua, be strong and courageous, because you these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. And so there's the charge to Joshua, to be faithful to the law. Now this is parallel with Joshua 8, right at the end of Joshua chapter 8. After there's been some initial military success in the land, and they've obviously crossed over the Jordan River, we get to verse 30, and we read in Joshua 8:30, then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. Verse 32, there in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua copied on stones the law of Moses which he had written. And then verse 34, let's go back to verse 33. All Israel, citizens alike, with their elders, officials, and judges, were standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, facing those who carried it. The priests, who were Levites, half of the people, stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had formerly commanded when he gave instructions to bless the people of Israel. And afterwards Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the aliens who lived among them. So the end of chapter 8 tells us that the charge that God gave to Joshua at the beginning of the book, Joshua kept. He was faithful to do all that was commanded of him to do in the book of the law. And particularly, he brought the people to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and there, as he was instructed in Deuteronomy chapter 11, he was instructed to read out the verses on those two mountains, and he did so. So the end of Joshua 8 wonderfully matches the beginning of Joshua chapter 1. Then you have chapters 2 and 7 tell stories. Chapter 2 is Rahab, who is a Gentile woman prostitute who comes to faith in Yahweh based on very limited knowledge, simply knowing what God has done for the Israelites in the wilderness, she comes to faith. Whereas in chapter 7, Achan, who is an Israelite wealthy male, he and his family, through unbelief, are removed from the covenant people of God. And those two stories are deliberately meant to be contrasted with one another because they are underlining this whole theme that goes through the Pentateuch, that faith is prior to the law, that the law is only going to work for those who have faith in Yahweh, that the important thing is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. If you can do that, that Shema, that one law, fulfills the whole. And it's all about faith. It's not about what gender you are. It's not about what ethnic origin you are. It's not about what position you hold in society. It's about faith. So even though those you think would be in, someone who's seen God work like Achan, who's wealthy and so blessed of God, you suppose, who's male, who's at the top of the social tree, he is thrown out through unbelief, whereas Rahab comes into the community of God because of her belief. So those two stories underscore that priority of faith, even under the law. Then, of course, chapters 3 and 6 are parallel with each other because both chapters describe Israel overcoming obstacles to inheriting the land through faith. And in chapter 3, the Jordan River stands up, and in chapter 6, the walls of Jericho fall down. And both are acts of God. And again, this demonstrates to the Israelite people, the people of God, that they will conquer and they will be successful as they have faith in the working of God. God is the one who will work on their behalf. Their role is to have faith, whether that be for the priests who are at the beginning of the line of the Jews, who to step into the Jordan River first so that the waters might stand up and the whole people might cross, or whether it be again the priests who are leading the people around the walls of Jericho in a very unusual strategy to take the city. Both miracles demonstrate the power of faith and the fact that it's God for the Israelites. In chapters 4 and 5, these are parallel in that you have the nation in the land for the first time in chapter 4. And this is when the manna stops because they're now able to eat of the fruit of the land as God had promised to them. This is where they have a Passover feast. This is where they have a circumcision ceremony. And so there's a sense in which Joshua's 4 and 5 are a picture of Israel in the land being prosperous and being blessed of God. The other thing I'd like to note about these early chapters of Joshua is that Joshua here is being commended by God because he is following in the footsteps of Moses. So you'll see that Joshua follows a similar path to Moses in terms of his leadership, and thus this validates his leadership before the people. So in chapter 1, God instructs him in the law, to keep the law. So there's your parallel with Moses. It's the law that was given to Moses. It's now entrusted to Joshua in chapter 1. In chapter 3, Moses goes through the Jordan River. He leads the people through the Jordan River, just like Moses led the people through the Red Sea. In chapter 4, you have the manna, which came under Moses' leadership, drying up, because under Joshua's leadership, they're now able to eat the abundance of the land. In chapter 5, right at the end of chapter 5, you have this unusual meeting that Joshua has with the commander of the Lord's army. And as Joshua is sort of doing some reconnaissance on the city, in Joshua chapter 5, verse 13, he comes and he sees a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword. And Joshua asked him, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And a very interesting reply in verse 14, the commander of the Lord's army says, "Neither." Wrong question, Joshua. It's not a matter of whose side I'm on, it's a matter of whose side you're on. He says, "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And so he's saying, Joshua, I'm the one who's going to fight, and you're on my side. Let's remember, this is not about you, this is about me. This is about Yahweh. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. So here you have an incident that is very similar to the burning bush incident of Exodus 3. So just as Moses encountered God in the burning bush, and it was sacred ground, and he took off his sandals, so too Jericho, before the battle of Jericho, encounters God. It's a holy moment. He takes off his shoes. And so in these ways Joshua is paralleled with Moses. So Joshua, a positive book. Things go well for the people because generally speaking they react with faith in the Lord, and they are faithful to obey the word from the heart. So Joshua, a positive book. But after the death of Joshua, life takes a decidedly turn for the worst for the nation of Israel. And that's what the book of Judges is all about. And in Judges, what we see is what happens to the nation when they don't love God with all their heart, when they don't have faith in Yahweh. The first two chapters of Judges are introductory. Joshua dies in both chapters, so the second chapter recounts the first events of the first chapter, and they give us an introduction to the book where they spell out what happens big picture. And what happens big picture in the time of the Judges, this 400-year period between, if you like, Joshua and the first king, King Saul, is that Israel as a nation forgets God. God raises up a foreign power to oppress them. After they're being oppressed for many years, they cry out to God for deliverance. They come to their senses, as it were. God hears their cries. He raises up a deliverer named a judge. That judge God uses to free the Israelites from their bondage. And as long as that judge lives, the Israelites thrive. But as soon as that judge dies, the Israelites forget about God and rebel. So God raises up another foreign power and the cycle continues. However, the book is not just cyclical. I think the book is a downward spiral, so that as the book recounts the main judges, chapters 3 through 16, each main judge seems to be a little bit worse than the preceding one, or at least the time in which those judges are ministering is a little bit worse than the time before. So Othniel is the first judge, and he's the best judge. Ehud comes next, but he's not quite as good as Othniel. Deborah is the third major judge, and she's a good judge, but the author deliberately brings her gender to the fore at the start of her story, and it's as if the author is saying Deborah is a woman, and a woman is leading Israel at this time. And so the question comes, well, where are the men? Where is the good godly male leadership in the country? Particularly given that Barak, Deborah's general, is not confident to go and fight the enemy by himself, and he has to ask for Deborah to come with him. And then in chapter 5, when Deborah sings a song of praise to God about the victory that has been won, as the song goes on, she starts to criticize the various tribes of Israel that did not come to help her. And so there's dissension and there's disunity in the tribes of Israel at the time of Deborah. The pivotal judge, the fourth judge, is Gideon. And Gideon starts out as a good judge, but he finishes as a poor judge, as a bad judge. He beats the Midianites, displaying great faith. But then when you look at chapter 8, the last two stories about Gideon are really, really sad. Look at chapter 8, verse 22. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you've saved us out of the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you," which is great. But then look what he does in verse 24. And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." And verse 25, they answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold he asked for came to 1,700 shekels. Verse 27, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Orphah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So though Gideon starts off as a good judge, displaying faith, he ends up leading the whole nation into idolatry. In fact, this passage alludes very strongly, of course, to the golden calf incident in Exodus. And so just as Aaron asked the people to donate gold and then made a golden calf out of that donated gold and then led them into idolatry, so too Gideon does exactly the same. He's another Aaron. The next story after that talks about Gideon's unrestrained lust. And so Gideon moves from being a good judge to a bad judge. And all the judges that come after him are also bad judges. Abimelech is the son of a prostitute, and his reign is characterized by civil war. It's Israelite versus Israelite under his reign. Then you have Jephthah, and Jephthah does not show a great understanding of the law, and because of that he makes a rash vow, and the consequence of that rash vow is that he offers his daughter, thinking that that is pleasing to Yahweh. So he's acting like a pagan, but thinking that it's pleasing to God. And then you have the last judge, which is Samson. We have 4 chapters on him, 13 through 16. And of course, Samson is, from the start, a very selfish individual. Life is all about him. He has an appetite for women that is unhealthy. He is arrogant. He is violent. He is disrespectful to his parents and to authority. Even at the end of his life, when he asks God to give him strength one more time, he's doing it to avenge his own eyes being plucked out, not really for the glory of God. And so Samson is the last and the worst of the judges. And by the time you get to the end of Samson's story, you're thinking, well, if these are the leaders of Israel, what a mess the country must be in. And that's what the conclusion that the author wants you to come to. But just in case you don't come to that conclusion, he's added 2 short stories. The first in chapters 17 and 18, and then the third, chapters 19 through 21. And these 2 short stories are serving to just underline, underscore how bad life was in Israel during the time of the judges. You think it's bad at the time of Samson, you haven't seen anything yet. It gets even worse than that. And so Judges demonstrates what happens when Israel turns away from God, what happens when they don't have faith, what happens when they don't love God with all their heart. The book is characterized by idolatry, by immorality, and by violence. Characteristics that characterize the pagans that the Israelites were meant to both replace but also to witness to. So the book tells us that Israel had become just like the pagan nations. They were not holy, they were not separate, distinct, set apart under God. They had compromised their faith, and they had become like the people they were meant to reach. And so Judges is a tragedy. The third of these historical books is the book of Ruth. Now, Ruth begins with 2 key statements. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So the first point to note is that the author of Ruth wants you to load the full context of the book of Judges into this story. This story is taking place when the judges ruled, and we know that when the judges ruled, the land was characterized by violence, by immorality, and by idolatry. People had a very low view of women at the time of the story of Ruth. Israel was not obeying God, they were not displaying faith. And more than that, there was a famine in the land, and we know from the law that the only time there would be a famine in the land of Israel was if they were disobedient to the covenant, and God is cursing Israel in order to get their attention so that they might be led to repentance. So these are dark times indeed when this story is being told. And there's a sense in which this story is not really about Ruth, and so the book is somewhat misnamed, because really the key character is Naomi. How do we know that? Well, we know that from the first 5 verses and then the last part of the narrative as well, because the story is told from the perspective of Naomi, not from the perspective of Ruth. So, for example, what happens is that you have a man whose name is Elimelech. His name means God is king, and he lives in a town called Bethlehem, which means house of bread. So a man whose name is God is king, who lives in the house of bread, leaves the house of bread during a famine to go to Moab. He takes his wife with him. His wife's name is Naomi. So Elimelech is not showing a lot of faith in God. And he takes Naomi into Moab, and in Moab, their two sons married two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But look at end of verse 4. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. And so we have grief described here, but it's the grief of Naomi, not the grief of Ruth. Ruth lost her husband, but the author doesn't mention anything about that. He wants us to focus on the grief of Naomi. If you go to chapter 4 and the end of the story, you know how it ends. You know that Ruth and Boaz get together and they have a son. That's in verse 13 of chapter 4. In verse 14, the women said to Naomi, after the birth of a son to Ruth, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. And the women living there said, look at this, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. So Naomi loses her family at the start of the book. She regains her family, in a sense, at the end of the book. And so the book is all about how Naomi is brought from being empty to being full, from being, if you like, cursed in her mind to being blessed. And the way that God brings that about is through the faithful obedience of two wonderful characters. Those characters are Ruth and Boaz. So Ruth is introduced to us in chapter 1, and in chapter 1 she comes to faith in Yahweh. She adopts Naomi's God as her God. And because of that, she is prepared to sacrifice her own well-being and her own future in order to stay with and look after her embittered mother-in-law. In chapter 2, she's prepared to go and work in order to feed Naomi, to look after her. She's just a wonderful, wonderful lady from the start to the end of this book. But then in chapter 2, she meets Boaz, and the first time we meet Boaz, he's very polite and he's gracious and he's blessing his workers, and he's looking after his workers, but he's also looking after the widows, and he's looking after the poor by allowing them to glean in his fields. He is obeying the true intent of the law. In Deuteronomy 10, Israel was told to favour and to bless the widows and the orphans and the poor and the aliens, and that's exactly what Boaz is doing. And so he's loving God from the heart. Ruth is loving God from the heart in looking after her mother-in-law. And so through the faithful obedience of these two people, God is going to bring about a change in the life of Naomi. In chapter 3 of the book, Ruth and Boaz meet at the threshing floor, and Ruth asks Boaz to marry her. Boaz agrees, but there's another guy who is first in line, so he has to deal with him in chapter 4. In chapter 4, he does so by being generous, because the nearer Redeemer doesn't want to sacrifice financially in order to care for the lineage of Elimelech. And because this nearer Redeemer doesn't care about the name of the deceased, his name is not recorded in the book. It's a curse on him, as it were. But Boaz is happy to forego sacrifice financially in order to honour the name of Elimelech, and so his name is honoured in this book. And so Ruth and Boaz just display this wonderful heart for God, this wonderful faithfulness, and through their faithfulness, Naomi moves from being empty to being full, from being bitter to being blessed. But not only that, Ruth and Boaz, through their faithfulness, don't just bring blessing to others around them and into their town, but they bring blessing into Israel in the long term. That's why the book ends with a genealogy that leads you to David, because through David, Messiah will come. And so the Abrahamic covenant will be fulfilled through this lineage. And so God is using these two wonderful people who are faithful to the Lord, Ruth and Boaz, not just to bring blessing into Naomi's life and the life of others around them, but to bring blessing into the nation and ultimately into the world. So this is a wonderful book in the context of an age, a time when everybody is doing what's right in their own eyes, when evil is flourishing, no one is obeying God, yet there are these two individuals who are faithful to God, who get it. And through their obedience and their faithfulness and their love for God, they bring blessing into the life of others and then ultimately into the nation's life. It's a book that holds out great hope for everyone who reads it, because it's saying to whoever reads it, it doesn't matter what's happening in your culture, it doesn't matter how bad things seem or are, God can use you in a significant way, and He can use you in ways that are way beyond your imagination. Not only can He use you to bring blessing in the life of others, but He can use you to bring blessing into the nation's life, into the world, through your faithfulness. So Ruth is a wonderful book giving people encouragement that under the law, it's still possible to be a blessing even if everybody else is not obeying the law. That's the book of Ruth.